My name's Andy Tidy and welcome to another edition of History Walks. This edition finds us in Stourport. Before Stourport was created, this was a small hamlet called Lower Mitten on the confluence of the River Stour and the River Severn. And at the time that the town was created, there were a mere handful of inhabitants, just 12 to be exact. Stourport is the archetypal canal town, built to serve the new canal where it joins the River Severn. Between 1760 and 1795, the population grew from a mere 12 to 1300. So in 1771, the southern half of the 46-mile Staffs and Worcester reached this point. And in reaching the River Severn, it spawned a whole new town development. Interestingly enough, during its construction and its planning, it was actually known as a new town, and that was its working title until it finally acquired a more appropriate name of Stourport. James Brindley was the supervising engineer for the canal, and its construction formed a core part of his Grand Trunk design, which would aim to connect the four major rivers of the UK. And the purpose of Stourport was to act as a transshipment point, where goods that would be travelling on the narrowboats, which were suitable for the canals, were transferred to the Severn Trows, boats much more suited to the moving waters of the River Severn. And to make that transfer, they needed a still water port. And that's where Stourport came in. And to make this happen, the canal company purchased 7 acres of land on the banks of the River Severn, just north of the River Stour. They also bought a parcel of land down by the Severn on which to build a brickworks, in which to build all the infrastructure, and they bought strips of land here above the basin which served a maintenance yard, which you see behind me, and the timber yard, which was here to my left. And the land they bought was flat and just above the floodplain, so it was unaffected by the rather precocious nature of the Severn when it goes into flood. Ever visited Stourport Basins, you'll find them an amazing mass of different basins. So my plan in this episode is to walk through the basins in the order in which they were constructed. Maybe that'll help us get clear exactly how they came to being. So let's go and have a look at the basins and see what we can see. Here we're looking at the Upper Old Basin. This was the first basin ever constructed, and it still forms the heart of the Stourport Docks complex. The Upper Basin was built in 1771 and many of the surrounding buildings date back to that time. Of all of the warehouses built in the 1770s, this one is probably the most distinctive. It's known as the Iron Warehouse, and it's remarkable because it has this amazing curved facade that goes around nearly 180 degrees. This is probably the oldest surviving canal warehouse anywhere in the country. And beyond it, along the quay, there was the Long Shed, a building long since demolished. And standing on the other side of the basin, there's another warehouse which is particularly distinctive on account of its bell tower. The warehouse itself was built in 1771, but the bell tower itself was constructed in 1812, and that was given with donated money raised by a grateful town. So this is the old Upper Basin, which was thronging with Severn Trows and narrowboats. But of course they came in here, but they also had to access the River Severn. And to do that, they used the original broad locks. So here at the bottom lock, the Severn Trows would embark onto the River Severn, making their way down to Worcester and to Gloucester, and then to transfer to the seagoing ships for distribution of goods all over the world. Here, right beside the bottom lock, is the star turn of the Stourport Basins complex, the Tontine Hotel. Tontine dominates the whole of the Basins complex. It started out as the Arley Inn and then became the Stourport Inn, but then finally settled on the name the Tontine. It was built by the Canal Company in 1773, so only 2 years after the canal had reached here. And it really was built before Stourport as a town had even got started. The place was a massive statement of faith by the Staffs and Worcester Canal Company. The hotel complex had space for 100 beds. It had a ballroom on its ground floor, and all the company meetings took place here. And it's believed that the name the Tontine was given to it on account of an association that used to meet here regularly. As far as I'm aware, the Tontine is quite unique. I'm not aware that anywhere else a canal company built a hotel to serve its visitors and its customers. But whilst the mighty Tontine started off as a grand dream by the canal company, ultimately the railways arrived, and more importantly, the Worcester-Birmingham Canal arrived and the company fell on hard times. And so fast forward 100 years to the year 1880, and a visitor wrote this about the Tontine. We found the company's great commercial hotel, the Tontine, a large square block with rooms sufficient to make up 100 beds and equally extensive stabling, diminished to the proportions of one of the smallest inns in town. Its extensive rooms let off to form dwelling houses. Fortunately, the Tontine's fortunes have revived. At one time it looked like it had been knocked down. These days it's been restored to something very close to its former glory. Fast forward 5 years to 1776, and with the Basins complex absolutely booming, the first extension that was made was to make a new lower basin. The new lower basin was built with a narrowboat access into the River Severn. This allowed narrowboats to pass through but using much less water. And at the same time, they built the covered dry dock that you see today. And in 1882, with the main basin proving to be inadequate, the Canal Company purchased some more land and built the new basin. This basin is also known as the Clock Basin. Now, the Stourport Basins just continue to thrive and thrive through the 40 years after they opened. But the trouble is, with just one narrow canal lock feeding the water into the basins, the question is, where does all the water come from to feed that big lock to get the Severn trows up and down off the Severn? Well, initially, the answer to that question lay at the foot of the River Stour. The Canal Company bought a watermill down on the Stour, and the watermill turned by the power of the river, and it lifted water up into a conduit, across an aqueduct, and then it fed its way back into the back end of the new basin. But with trade prospering to the extent that it did, this solution just wasn't enough. So, in 1805, 30 years after the canal basins had opened, the Canal Company built this basin. This is Engine Basin. And this basin has an open access into the River Severn. So it was quite possible, when conditions were favourable, for the Severn trows to come in here and berth up, load, unload, and go on their way without using any water whatsoever from the canal basins above. But that wasn't the end to Engine Basin. And here the name gives something of a clue. At the far end of Engine Basin there was a steam engine, and that steam engine was used to pump water up from this basin fed by the River Severn into the upper levels of the basin complex. Now, the area of the loading wharfs has all long gone and been recycled into the funfair, which is a trademark feature of Stourport today. This engine lifted water up the 31 feet into the old basin. This old steam engine carried on pounding away until World War I, when it was finally scrapped. If you walk to the very end of the funfair and you look at the multi-storey building, that is the reduced remains of the old pumping engine. With the engine basin completed in 1805, the Basins complex continued to grow and grow. So the Canal Company turns its eyes eastwards. And here, between 1806 and 1810, they built the Inner Basin, or Lichfield Basin. The Inner Basin was demolished and filled in the 1950s, but has recently been excavated, and the stub arms you can see going off to the left are the truncated representations of the old arms that went in further, and off to the right you can see a little inlet, and that's the point where an exit led through to dry docks, and also an exit into a further lower basin called Cheapside Basin. So I'm standing in the entrance to Cheapside Basin. This was built in 1812 and included a lock down into this additional basin squeezed in between here and the River Severn. Whilst the sign on the wall says that the basin was restored to navigation and finger pontoons and mooring buoys were installed, the access rights have never been figured out, so a barrier remains fixed in place and the basin remains sterile and boatless, unlike the hustle and bustle of the basin outside. And here, tucked in behind the new modern development, is one of the old wharf cottages which bounded the edge of the Cheapside Basin. Cheapside Basin was a long thin sliver of water which was bounded by Cheapside Road, which I'm standing in, and occupied the site in here. This later became the site of the gasworks. And beyond the gasworks there stood the enormous electricity works. The Cheapside Basin extended away to the left of this road and came to an end where I'm standing as Cheapside continues on around the corner and down to the River Severn. Alongside the basins there were the offices and the houses for the hauliers and merchants, and to house them both professionally and personally, Mart Lane was constructed. And this style of construction was taken for the rest of the high street of the town, so you end up with this same rather attractive vernacular style appearing all the way through the old part of Stourport. Here at the bottom of Mart Lane you find the old warehouses, and you can still see the archways built into the frontages of the modern houses. And so we finished this history walk back at that great statement of faith, the Tontine Hotel. The last great basin was built at Cheapside in 1812, and then just 2 years later the Worcester-Birmingham Canal was completed, and that gave a much quicker and a much more direct route down from Birmingham down into Worcester. Trade dwindled and investment ceased, and there was nothing built on this site of any significance after that. But the one unanswered question is why, in spite of the prosperity of the port failing, did the site remain in such a wonderfully pristine condition? If you remember, its parallels were Ellesmere Port, Runcorn and Goole. The difference of those other three sites is that they were all seaside ports. So when the canal trade came to an end, they switched their attention to saltwater transport and they grew their sea trade. But here at Stourport, we're many miles up the River Severn, and any seagoing trade was taken by Gloucester down at the far end. Stourport just drifted into obscurity. Apart from one or two basins being filled in to make way for a gasworks and an electric station, the basin complex remained largely untouched. And so the benefit of that drift into obscurity is that we have this lovely architectural gem which is commonly known as Birmingham by the seaside. For decades, the people of Birmingham come to Stourport to see the river, to see the basins, to drink in the pubs and to go to the fun fair. So trade through Stourport may have by and large come to an end 200 years ago, but due to its location it's remained the gem that it is today. I hope you have enjoyed this walk through the basins of Stourport, and I hope maybe it gives you a bit of an idea of the sequence in which they were built.